I'll just add my welcome too. I appreciate you all spending an hour with us this evening and helping us think about this National Register project, which I have to say has just been fascinating so far for us. And we're really excited about how things are coming along. So I'm glad you guys are with us to help think that through. So I think we can go on. Here's the outline for our plan for the next little bit. First, we are going to just share a little bit about the National Register, which may or may not be familiar to most folks on the call. And then we're going to talk about why one might rewrite a National Register listing. You might wonder if it's already on the register, why do that again? We'll cover that. We'll share a little bit of our findings so far. And then we want to invite your input and help. I'm thinking about what else we need to be doing, things you know that we should be thinking about.
Yes, so and I'll throw in my welcome as well here too, but just to give folks a sense of the sort of apparatus we're working with, the National Register of Historic Places is the sort of official list of our nation's historic places worthy of preservation. It's created in 1966 and has been going ever since. There's about 100,000 properties across the United States that are listed on the National Register of Historic Places. It's all these places that we think should, that are important and deserve preservation. Being on the National Register is purely honorary, so there's no restrictions to anything you can do. It doesn't regulate paint color or anything like that. It's all voluntary and honorary. And there are certain tangible and intangible benefits to being a designated site on the National Register of Historic Places. So you have to meet certain criteria for designation, not just anything can get on. So there are a wide variety of criteria such as historical, cultural, architectural, or even archaeological significance. And something can be significant at the local, state, or national level, or all three at the same time. And then you can have a historic district, which is sort of a bounded area, or you can have a single individual property or building that's listed on it. So in Hadley, there are three National Register districts in existence today. So the North Hadley district, which is the red blob up top, the Hadley Center National Register district, which is that big red blob in the center, and then the Hockanum Rural district, which is that blob down at the bottom. And so collectively, those encompass about 800 individual buildings, which overall the boundaries encompass about 3,800 acres of land in Hadley. So a significant amount of Hadley is already sort of represented in the National Register of Historic Places. And Porter-Phelps-Huntington Foundation is the only individual structure that's actually listed in Hadley. And so part of what we're doing is through this Underrepresented Communities program that the Park Service puts on, which while there may be all of these properties on the National Register, they don't necessarily reflect the sort of breadth and diversity of things that have taken place in the past of various historical actors. So the Park Service created this program to try and increase the amount of diversity that's reflected in the National Register itself. And for those of you at home, you're welcome to do some of your own national research as well. The state of Massachusetts very helpfully maintains the Massachusetts Cultural Resource Information System, which you can go to by accessing that link there, and you can see all the nominations that were prepared in Hadley and across the state of Massachusetts, and you can look at any property that's ever been inventoried as well. And then we'll also just throw a quick plug in here for this book, which is based on a compilation of inventories that were done of historic barns in Hadley. So this also reflects the way that information can kind of travel outside of the National Register and inform other kinds of scholarship going on.
So on this topic of why rewrite a nomination, National Register nominations are, the older ones are very brief. They're just a couple of pages. More recently, they're quite voluminous. The nomination for the Kent State site, for instance, runs to about 100 pages. And so National Register nominations really are resources that communities use to understand buildings in them. And as you see on the slide, you see them all the time on Wikipedia. It's a great source of information. And yet, once they're written, they tend to kind of freeze. They're static. Only 3% of National Register listings are ever revisited. And, that's a shame because a lot of them were written in the 1960s, 70s, 80s. We continue to learn things about these sites. Our questions change, and that doesn't find its way back to the register. So this project is important because it's going to become one of those 3% that revisits its nomination. You can find online the original nomination from 1973 for 40 acres and see how quite brief it is, and just describes the farm as a treasury of rural life and a memorial to this single family. And we all know, as Brian just said, the story is much bigger. These are the areas of significance that were signaled in the 70s, significant for its architectural style and the early settlement of the region. At that time, the register didn't have a lot of these other areas of significance that it has now. Women's history, labor history, a lot of the things that scholars started talking about in the 70s, 80s, 90s, and today are now a formal category in the register, but they weren't in 1973. So that's another good reason to go back and rethink. So we have come to this with a lot of new research questions, and over the years, a lot has been learned about Porter-Phelps-Huntington. And because the grant that is supporting this work asks us to emphasize underdocumented communities, these are some of the things that we're really prioritizing so that the narration in the new nomination talks about the family, the Porter, Phelps, and Huntington families, but also about the history of farming from the 18th century to the 20th century. We're interested in documenting where the broom corn and silk crazes and other trends in agriculture intersect with the history of this site. We're interested in women's history, again, not just the women of the family, but the domestic servants who worked there and their children. We're interested in labor history. There's a ton of labor history stories at this site. Local hired labor, indentured laborers, and of course, at the next bullet point, enslavement was present at 40 acres. And we're going to work that into the narration so that that also is an important part of the history of the site and needs to be present in the National Register. In the 18th century, at least one, and we think two POWs lived at the site. John Morrison was a Scots Highlander who was captured during the American Revolution and dispatched to Hadley as replacement farm labor. He wound up spending the rest of his life. He lived in Hadley till the 19th century as a gardener at 40 acres. And George Andrews, we believe, was also a Hessian who was dispatched also to the site and lived in a cottage on the site. So we're exploring that as other threads of labor history at the site. Native American history is an important thread in the site as well, not only for the histories of displacement, which also are not narrated and need to be in the towns or in the site's nomination, but also because Native women were present in the site through the 18th and early 19th century. There's a lot of mythology that believes that Native people were no longer present in the valley by the late 18th century, but that is certainly not the case. And they also lived and worked at 40 acres. So we want to make sure the nomination tells that story too. And then the last theme, and you'll hear a little bit more about this later, is pastkeeping. We are very interested in documenting the site's own history from working farm to summer residence to historic site and museum. And so we're going to be talking about that very process in the nomination. It all feels kind of meta. And so I feel like now with Facebook, we can't talk about things being meta anymore, but it all does seem a little bit meta. So those are the kinds of themes that we're looking into.
So then another significant portion of the National Register nomination process is devoted to documenting the site's current conditions, both through photography as well as a written architectural description. And this is especially important for sites that are significant as works of architecture, as this one is already nominated for. And that portion or that area of significance we will keep as well in our updated nomination. But the narration of the site's architecture also sort of supports and supplements some of these historical narratives that we're talking about. So we're not just simply documenting this sort of objective like status for like how the property like looks to with like this cold calculating eye. We're trying to use it to furnish some of the expansions of the narration that we're hoping to include in this nomination. So in 1973, when the original nomination was written, folks might have been more interested in these really important and high style public spaces in these homes that were sort of represented gentility in that time. So we have this photo over here of the long room in Porter-Phelps-Huntington, and then the library fireplace in Charles Phelps's home across the street. And so since we're interested in looking at labor history, women's history, the history of pastkeeping, we want to see those kinds of working spaces reflected. So this space in the North L of Porter-Phelps-Huntington is very important for us to try and document and reflect that documentation. There are other parts of the landscape that are important, like the farmyard over at Phelps Farm, where folks would have been working day in and day out in these barns, as well as the transformation of a place like Porter-Phelps-Huntington into this museum and sort of genteel landscape. We have this photo of the Sunken Garden here, which is made from the foundations of what was a working site, was one of the home's larger barns. And so documenting that transformation and its impact on the landscape is really important for us, and not just these sort of public, maybe typical spaces that you'd think are the most important to sort of have represented in this nomination. And then, of course, some of our really fun discoveries through this process too are, as we've been documenting the property's current conditions, are this connection to Asher Benjamin, who in the early 19th century and late 18th century was a very important architect in the Connecticut Valley and helped popularize sort of federal building styles through a series of handbooks that he published and were widely distributed across the early United States. And so for a very long time, there's been this thought that is there this Asher Benjamin connection over at Phelps Farm. And you can see this screenshot from one of his builder's guides for a fireplace and how the builder would have to carve and make that fireplace. And then you can see down at the bottom here that it's a pretty darn close match. And so there's been this thought, like, what is the Asher Benjamin connection here? Did he design the house? Did he have a hand in its design? Did Phelps and Benjamin even know one another? And we had this exciting discovery that places them sort of in the same place at the same time, where both Phelps, who you can see down there at the bottom, and Asher Benjamin were both sort of working with the Board of Assistant Assessors for the town of Boston. So we know they're swimming in the same circles, which is a really exciting thing and really helps us think through some of the origins of these properties and how they've changed over time.
So as I mentioned, we are trying to do some of this more inclusive storytelling, and I've covered most of these 3 points, but I want to also say one of the themes here in Hadley that we're especially interested in surfacing in this opportunity to retell these stories are free Black laborers in the area. Joshua Boston is an example of that. Sarah Jackson was a dairy woman who worked for the household. And here, this was exciting for me to find over the summer. This is a record book of cash payments from the farm. And if you look at the very bottom, you see Lucinda Till taking in washing. And we knew about Bill Till and Dudley Till, who performed farm work here on the property, but I had not yet seen about Lucinda Till doing washing. And so it's an opportunity to think about how the farms and the families were integrated into the local community through the labor that helped them run the farm. So that's the kind of stories we want to tell. So we will, as we develop the story of Phelps Farm, we'll be looking for those kinds of stories to think about, what kind of labor made Phelps Farm possible. But another of the fascinating discoveries in new archival material over the summer were stories of Charles P. Phelps, so that's the builder of Phelps Farm, and his investments in commodities that are rooted in the Atlantic slave economy. He would buy with other investors quantities of Cuban sugar and South Carolina cotton and other commodities that were deeply dependent on enslaved labor forces around the Caribbean basin. And then they would ship that to Rotterdam and Amsterdam and hopefully to their point at a profit. And so one of the things that, we've been thinking about are, how do stories of enslavement and freedom play out here in Hadley and in the Valley? But we also want to be mindful that there are bigger stories, global stories that intersect with those themes abroad. So that's another thread that will appear in our new narrative. A big focus of the narrative, to no one's surprise, and a theme we thought we'd focus on tonight, is the history of agriculture. And so just to run through some of the 19th century phenomenon, in the 18th century, when it was Moses and Elizabeth, and then Charles and Elizabeth on the west side of the road, fattening cattle was a big industry. That was something Phelps Farm was deeply invested in. 40 acres was deeply invested in. In time, they put a toe in the water of the broom corn phenomenon, but it was really the next generation, Dan Huntington and Elizabeth Whiting Phelps-Huntington, who were pretty significantly invested in the broom corn industry and broom corn production. But Dan Huntington was interested in a lot of things. And so he also was interested in the silkworm craze and really thought that was going to be the shape of the future. He was kind of dismayed and disappointed when that didn't really pan out. I am very keen to know whether there are any mulberry trees left in Hadley. So if anybody on the call for any reason knows that, I'd love to hear. Both sides of the street raised sheep at different times. Phelps Farm was invested in merino sheep, which is another kind of agricultural trend that raced through the valley. He describes that as a failure. He never has anything good to say about his efforts in the merino sheep industry, but there are sheep on both sides of the street for long histories of these properties. And so we're interested in that. The dairy industry, and we're going to come back to that and hopefully talk about that more in a little bit, is one of the major themes on both sides of the street. In the early period, Elizabeth Porter-Phelps and her mother before her were deeply invested in butter and cheese production. And we know a lot about that because a lot of good records survive from that era. In the 19th century, we start to see a shift toward milk production in the valley. And so by that period of time, 40 acres has become mostly a summer home and kind of a hobby farm. So there's some of all of these things present at 40 acres, but we see milk production is the big story at Phelps Farm on the east side of the street, and we will circle back to that. I'll just mention that we don't see tobacco as one of the things that the family gets interested in, and that's kind of surprising given the embrace of tobacco as a crop here in Hadley. And I have not yet learned if there's a reason for that, if they had some, if they thought about tobacco and declined going into that, but that's not part of this family story, which is just interesting. Yes, as I just mentioned, the main story at 40 acres in terms of farming is its trajectory from, it's a large farm in 1752. It becomes this 600-acre farm. It's the biggest farm in town in the 1850 agricultural census. But over time, as Frederick Dan Huntington and his family have the property, they use it as a summer home, and they continue farming. They're very interested and invested in farming as part of their family's tradition, but it is not it's no longer responding to trends in agriculture. They just like to keep some cows, they keep some chickens, they have some farm interest. And then as I'll mention in a moment, there's a little bit of interest in dairy work in the early 20th century. So at that period, just at the turn of the 20th century, dairy becomes in Massachusetts the most important branch of agriculture. And that's got to do with the advent of homogenization and pasteurization. The railroad's arrival in the 19th century is part of this story because it makes products shippable in a way that they hadn't been before. And so right at the turn of the century, both sides of the street get interested in farming. And this is Henry Barrett, or in dairy farming. And Henry Barrett Huntington is the representative of that moment at 40 acres on the west side of the street. But the big story is at Phelps Farm. And this has all been just fascinating for me to learn. And the thumbnail sketch of it all is that in 1910, Ruth Huntington Sessions becomes sort of the captain of the ship at Phelps Farm. And she's the one who really wants to see them commit to dairying. They have an accredited Jersey herd that there were Jersey cows on the other side of the street already. And she runs kind of a private dorm for students at Smith College. And as she takes over Phelps Farm, she needs to make the farm pay for itself. I think that's a quote from her book, 60 Odd. And so she creates a connection between Phelps Farm and this dorm at Smith College. And Phelps Farm provides dairy goods for this, not only Sessions House, but other dorms that serve Smith College students. So with that commitment, the cottage that today survives for the farm manager was something she had built, and she expanded the barn to serve a larger herd. In time, she gets her son to join her, and the dairy continues to expand. So we've got some of these dates on a timeline here. In 1926, they build a milk house equipped with the latest appliances. So this is to, pasteurize milk and support this expanded dairy industry. They, in a booklet that surfaced over the summer on the history of Phelps Farm, we learned that they served over 30 residents of Amherst, Northampton, and Hadley, and 40 to 50 college faculty at Smith. And I've put in a request at Smith to see if they have records on their end that will help us understand Smith College's investment in Phelps Farm. About 1930, the size of the herd grows to 55 or 60, and that's kind of where it will stay for the next couple of decades. We've included a slide to show the city directory shows Ruth as the milk dealer and John as the farmer, which is interesting in a sort of gender story way. And then in 1942, the milk route is sold when John Sessions decides to take a job at Mount Holyoke College. And so these are two big themes. So Brian's going to talk a little bit about this pastkeeping theme, and then we're going to come back to farming, and then we're going to ask you guys to help us think a little bit.
Yeah, so we've mentioned a little bit this like pastkeeping thing. So like, what do we mean when we sort of actually say this? What we're talking about primarily is 40 acres transition into a museum, which starts as early as the 1920s with James Lincoln Huntington, who eventually forms the Porter-Phelps-Huntington Foundation in the 1950s that still carries on the house as a museum. And so pastkeeping for James Lincoln Huntington meant sort of creating these historical narratives that are imparted through the landscape, through oral traditions, through written narratives, and they're sort of produced and then reproduced over time, right? And so what we have at both sites are efforts on the part of, especially of James Lincoln Huntington over at 40 acres, to emphasize the sort of genteel aspects of his own family lineage. And so one of the more concrete examples of that is in this picture here, which you can see the South L over at 40 acres. That's the woodshed with the sort of blind arches that's off on the right. And then there's this very alarming gap between what's now known as the Shays House and the rest of the South L, where James Lincoln Huntington completely torn down the sort of southern bent of that L and had it reconstructed in the late 1920s. He later did the same thing for the Shays House, which is off over there on the left, which is rebuilt also around that same time and turned into a modern house. And so through this very like literal process of rebuilding, we can see the kinds of things that Huntington was interested in focusing on, the kinds of stories he was interested in telling. And so I think the thing I've continually said to Marla throughout this project is we're both looking at a house from the 18th century, but we're also looking at what someone from the 1920s thought a house from the 18th century should look like, right? So there's a lot of layers to what we're seeing here and the stories that Huntington was interested in telling are sort of being reflected back through the creation of the museum and its sort of physical reconfiguration as well. And that's certainly happening to an extent at Phelps Farm. And the family across generations has been very interested in documenting its own past, its own lineage. So there's a very rich history to draw from there as well.
So we thought we'd just wrap up by kind of focusing on dairy farming in 20th century Hadley. It's funny, I mean, to pick up on something Brian just said, the house's archival record is enormous. And so we really know a lot more about the 18th and 19th century than we do the 20th, because the archival record is so rich for the early period. And so I think one of the things that I found really interesting by training, I'm a historian of the 18th century, so this is all very new to me and fun and exciting to learn about, but we thought we would focus a little bit on dairy farming in 20th century Hadley.
And so, yeah, one of the things we're interested in hearing more about from those in attendance this evening are what are some of the, what do you find to be the most important trends in Hadley's dairy industry from any point in the 20th century? Like Marla said, we're sort of lacking for some of this really rich documentation of the 20th century. And so we know that there's a tradition of dairy farming in Hadley, which you can see from these photos here. The one on the left is of the Barstow Dairy down in Hockenham, which has been primarily a dairy since the 1920s and is still going today. And then there's this other dairy barn over on East Street. So there's remnants of this industry that are still kind of with us today. But yes, that's one of the things we're interested in hearing more about from everyone here.
And I'll add that if you don't have answers, we'll also take questions. Like what kinds of things would you like to know, or what do you think we should be looking for as we continue to research this? What questions would you bring to this query? So that also would be of interest to us. And then just to wrap up, really, just some other things in case people are in the room. We were kind of thinking what would we love to hear in case people are in the room who would know? And one of them, I'm just keen to know more about these milk routes. I've seen pictures of milk trucks from the period. So if any of you in the Zoom space are familiar with milk routes in Hadley, remember milk trucks coming, any of that, can be helpful to us. Today, I started thinking about milk co-ops, and we would love to know more about the co-ops in the area. We know that Phelps Farm milk went to a local co-op, so we're interested in hearing more about that. And then I just put on this slide at the last minute a couple of things that have come up about place names. And we thought, since we have some Hadley folks in the room, there is a brook that runs behind the house that might be called Holman's Brook. We don't see it named on a lot of maps, so if somebody knows or has heard local names for this brook that runs down behind the house, that would be great. We see a lot of archival references to Pleasant Hill, and I am not entirely sure which rise is Pleasant Hill. So again, we thought if we have some local folks, we would kind of hear from you about that. But with that, we're happy to stop the screen share. There's our contact info if people have information and you want to send it separately. But we certainly hope that in the time that we have remaining this evening, that folks will be interested in sharing information you have, asking questions, telling us where you think we should be looking. So with that, we'll say thank you, and we'll give you the podium.